Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going on an absolutely epic evolutionary journey to discover exactly how life on Earth unlocked its ultimate power source. It's a story of gritty survival, of microscopic ingenuity, and of a massive planetary shift that made complex life, including you and me, totally possible. If you've ever wondered how biology powered up from simple single-celled organisms just floating around in the primordial soup to the incredibly complex beings we are today, well, you are definitely in the right place. Okay, let's dive into this. To really appreciate where we are now, we kind of have to look at this as a high-stakes underdog story. Billions of years ago, early life was facing a massive energy crisis. They were totally surrounded by potential fuel, but they just didn't have the biological machinery to extract enough energy from it to do anything more than just barely scrape by. So the central question we're exploring today is this: how did simple cells solve this massive crisis and actually get enough energy to eventually build complex structures, form organs, and, well, become us? To answer that, here is our roadmap. We're going to track the evolution of energy through 4 distinct eras. We'll start with fermentation, move on to anaerobic respiration, experience the absolute game changer of aerobic respiration, and finally, look at the arrival of mitochondria. Part 1. The beginning of energy. Fermentation. Let's step way back in time to the biological dark ages of energy. Back then, the Earth's atmosphere had virtually no oxygen, and the very earliest organisms had to just scrape by to survive in some really harsh, unforgiving environments. In those conditions, life relied on fermentation. Now, while it was absolutely essential for keeping those early cells alive, it was incredibly inefficient. You can really think of fermentation as a biological band-aid. It was just a quick and dirty way to extract barely enough energy from nutrients to keep the cellular lights on, but it offered a really pitiful energy output. It was a pure survival tactic, definitely not a strategy for growth. Now, what's really interesting about this is that early metabolism was basically a microscopic trap. Because it operated entirely without oxygen, relying on just a simple breakdown of nutrients, it yielded extremely low amounts of ATP, which is cellular energy. Without a larger biological energy budget, life simply couldn't afford to build complex features. Honestly, if this had remained the only way to get energy, life on Earth would have just stayed microscopic forever. There was simply no fuel for anything bigger. Part 2. The limits of anaerobic respiration. But, life is incredibly adaptable. Eventually, nature developed its next biological software upgrade, moving from basic fermentation to anaerobic respiration. This was essentially an attempt to optimize energy intake. While fermentation only partially broke down nutrients, anaerobic respiration actually allowed cells to use other inorganic molecules, things like sulfate or nitrate, to pull just a little bit more energy out of their food. It was for sure a step up. The biological engines were running slightly better. But because they were still operating entirely without oxygen, life was still severely bottlenecked. And that brings us to a really harsh biological reality. This bottleneck meant that without a much more powerful electron acceptor, meaning without oxygen, complex life was fundamentally impossible. I want you to really think about this for a second. You require massive, continuous amounts of ATP just to keep your brain functioning, to pump your blood, to move your muscles. Without breaking through this low ATP ceiling, you wouldn't have the energy to even exist, let alone sit here and watch this explainer. Something drastic had to change. Part 3. Oxygen changes the game. And change it did. We've finally arrived at the climax of our evolutionary story. The Earth's atmosphere shifted, oxygen levels began to rise, and it introduced the ultimate final electron acceptor. So the crucial point is that cellular energy generation is basically just the flow of electrons. But those electrons have to go somewhere at the very end of the process, right? Otherwise, the whole system just backs up and completely stops. Well, oxygen acts as the absolute perfect exhaust system for these cellular engines. It's incredibly hungry for electrons, pulling them through the system rapidly and safely. And this is what allowed for an unprecedented, massive production of ATP. Let's contrast this directly. We go from anaerobic respiration, our old, gritty, low-efficiency survival mechanism, to aerobic respiration, this brand new, highly efficient, oxygen-powered system. It is literally like trading in a sputtering, old steam-powered bicycle for a high-performance sports car. The biological ingenuity here is just staggering. By simply utilizing a toxic gas that happened to be accumulating in the atmosphere, oxygen, life suddenly found the key to practically limitless energy. The shift in the hard numbers is wild. Before oxygen, breaking down a single molecule of glucose through fermentation or those basic anaerobic pathways netted a tiny little trickle of roughly 2 ATP. But after oxygen was utilized, that exact same single molecule of glucose suddenly yields roughly 36 ATP. That is nearly a 20-fold increase in power. This wasn't just some minor upgrade, it was a literal planetary energy boom that changed the trajectory of life on Earth forever. Part 4: Mitochondria and the Evolutionary Leap. Let's see how this builds, because a software upgrade that huge really requires a hardware upgrade to run it. Where exactly was all this incredible aerobic respiration taking place? Enter the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion are the ultimate biological hardware upgrade. They are specialized structures right inside our cells that are entirely dedicated to harnessing oxygen. And interestingly enough, evolutionary biology tells us they were actually once independent bacteria. They were swallowed by a larger cell and they basically struck a deal. Hey, you give us a safe place to live, and we will produce an absolute ocean of ATP for you. It was the ultimate biological merger. This cascading energy revolution happened fast. By successfully harnessing oxygen using their brand new mitochondrial hardware, cells unlocked a massive, sustained ATP output. And with this abundance of energy finally secured, simple cells were no longer trapped in survival mode. They could actually afford to evolve complex internal structures, and that led straight into what we call the eukaryotic energy revolution. This revolution changed absolutely everything. This incredible energy surplus unlocked the complex cellular structures that define eukaryotic life. It gave cells the energy budget they desperately needed to stick together, cooperate, and actually allow multicellular life to form. Quite simply, it powered the evolution of plants, animals, and human beings. Actually, I want you to take a deep breath right now. Seriously, do it. That oxygen you just pulled into your lungs, it is traveling to your cells right now, entering your mitochondria, and acting as that final electron acceptor, keeping you alive. You are actively running this ancient evolutionary machinery at this very second. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought to ponder. If oxygen never became our energy source, what would life look like today? Without that incredible leap in ATP efficiency, Earth might still be a quiet, invisible world populated entirely by microscopic single-celled organisms, just scraping by in the dark. Oxygen wasn't just a breath of fresh air, it was literally the spark that ignited complex life. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.